Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel wherever you are in the world, and I hope I find you in a good place now and that you're going to get that lovely hot cup of cocoa or that cup of tea or whatever it is you drink, because we've got a lovely story tonight and I am so pleased you're in good spirits. So I hope you're going to keep lovely and warm as the weather starts to get colder, because that's what we need to do, and keep your immune system strong, because there are lots of viruses and flu out there at the moment. And we've got a lovely story tonight which you're really going to enjoy. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up. And you're always welcome to share these stories, because I love, to get the stories out there. So if somebody hasn't heard any of my stories, let them listen to them, because it's nice to spread them out. Let's continue with tonight's story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, I was 16 years old at the time when a curveball was thrown indiscriminately at my family that none of us ever saw coming. It would ultimately change our lives in ways we never imagined possible, and not in a good way, I'm afraid to say. But luckily, with the course of time, the storm did quickly pass by, even though this was a bad one. But against the odds, things returned to normal, as the storm only lasted for a very short while, thanks to my mother's incredible ability to bounce back from a tumultuous situation, rather like the perennial daffodils in spring that come back year after year, even when the weather has delayed its promises. I was known to my friends as Howie, although my real name was actually Howard, although few people chose to call me by my full name, while my sister Victoria, who was 14 years old, 2 years my junior, never ever had her name shortened by her peers to Vicky. I don't believe for a minute that the name Vicky would have ever suited my sister. Even her friends seemed to appreciate that. My sister was definitely a Victoria in every sense of the word. She was courageous, bold, but also, despite being a perennial tomboy, she possessed an understated elegance that made my mother wonder whether in her later life she would shed the tomboy veneer. She would one day blossom into a girly girl, and I hasten to say by the time she reached her late teens, that's exactly what happened to my sister. And if I tried to remind her what a tomboy she used to be, I hasten to say her memory has become rather select in that regard. I do recall every afternoon, me and my sister Victoria would be routinely sitting at our desks in our bedrooms upstairs, dutifully doing our homework, under the insistent, rather devoted supervision of my mother, who liked her children to have an ordered structure to their lives, which was something she'd never had herself growing up. So she wanted it all the more for us. I guess you always want for your children what you never ever had for yourself. My mother's own life growing up had been so scattered. Her parents had moved away regularly from state to state and town to town when she was a little girl. Let's just say my mother had been to more schools than some people have had hot dinners. It meant she'd never felt settled in her life. No sooner had she made friends at her new school in a new state, and now she was adjusting to a whole new life, and then her parents would announce they were moving away again, and when she asked them why they were moving, her father's answer would invariably always be the same. "Your mother's not happy here, Ashley, so we need to move away, I'm afraid." He would whisper to my mother, "Your mum's got itchy feet again. Have to keep her happy, don't I, love? Or we'll never hear the end of it." My mother was soon to learn it was not the places that her parents moved to that were the problem, or the people living in the various states they went to live in. It was her restless mother, who was like a migratory bird, with an urgent burning itch or a desire to fly away at a moment's notice. If you didn't know any better, you might believe that my grandmother was descended from gypsy lineage, as travelling around the place came a quintessential way of life for my mother. Suffice to say, because of all this moving around, my mother felt like a fish out of water. I think this was one of the quintessential reasons my mother was so fiercely attracted to my father Simon when she met him all those years ago. I suspect she knew, deep in her heart, he would give her the stout stability that she ravenously craved in her own life. My mother first met my father Simon while walking the family dog, a black Scottish terrier called Conway, who the vet insisted was getting far too fat and would need at least 3 walks a day. This was part of the prescription for Conway, including a rather fearsome, calorie-restricted diet. My grandmother Chloe, my mother's mother, was of course not remotely amused by any of this. She believed that Dr. Erickson's strict exercise protocol was way too excessive for the small dog. She reminded the vet that poor old Conway had short legs. But the vet said the legs weren't the problem, but the lack of exercise most certainly was. "Next time I see Conway, Mrs. Curtis, I expect to see he's lost a significant amount of weight. Your dog is obese. His weight is a problem. It can cause health problems later along down the line." My grandmother Chloe begrudgingly put my mother Ashley in charge of dog walking duties. As my grandmother was lazy, she didn't like to walk anywhere. She tirelessly complained that her hip was hurting, but my mother never believed that this was true. It was just an excuse. My mother enjoyed walking Conway, but the dog was beginning to find 3 walks a day was way too excessive for his short little legs to endure. My mother was 23 years old at the time, my father 22. My father had been driving down the road, feeling hopelessly lost. He couldn't find the road he was looking for. Everything was so badly signposted in that neighbourhood. All of a sudden my dad spotted a pretty young lady walking a very overweight black Scottish terrier down the road, which he found a rather endearing sight. The dog looked as if he was completely fed up with all the walking, and had just about had enough. He couldn't help but think my mother looked like she was familiar with the area. My father was in 2 minds as to whether to stop this young lady, to ask her for directions, but he was so desperate to find the place he was looking for. He'd been driving around and around in circles for what seemed like an endless age. He stopped his car opposite my mother and called out to her, "Excuse me, ma'am. So sorry to trouble you like this, but I'm looking for Glenford Terrace. You don't happen to know where I might find the place? I promised a good friend of mine I'd drop a parcel off for him to a Mr. and Mrs. Richards, but this is the first time I've been in the area. Everything around here is so badly marked. So to be frank, I can't see the wood for the trees. I've been driving around in absolute circles and getting nowhere terribly fast. I wouldn't ask you for directions, but there's no one else around, and you look like you might know the area rather well." My mother smiled at my father warmly. "You're lost, all right," she said, letting out a cheery laugh. "I haven't lived here that long, you know. My family moves around a lot thanks to my mother. It's hard to explain where Glenford Terrace is. The place is ambiguously obscure, I'm afraid. A little off the beaten track, you could say. It's clandestinely buried behind a plethora of trees. You can't see the house from the road. I don't know how to give you good directions to explain how to get there. I can put money on it that you'll never ever find it." "That bad?" said my father, raising a brow. "Just my luck, it would seem." My mother looked at my father sympathetically. Suddenly her face brightened, as if she had a grand idea. "I tell you what, how about I show you the way there? I'm afraid you're a long way off from your destination. Everybody tirelessly complains about how badly signposted everything is around here. But nobody does a damn thing about it. It makes me mad. I can see you're not a local from around here, and I'm afraid when newcomers come to the area, they get very confused and hopelessly lost. Some visitors actually go to the sheriff's office to ask for directions. It's really that bad." "Well, they're not wrong about that," my father agreed. "Someone needs to get their act together, don't they? And mark some of these roads. Whereabouts is the sheriff's office? I could go there myself and get directions from him. Maybe you can direct me there." "Don't be silly. There's no need to do that. I'll show you where Glenford Terrace is. It really is no skin off my nose." My mother beckoned for my father to open the passenger side door for her, which he did, if rather reluctantly. To my father's astonishment, my mother had climbed into the passenger side seat beside him, with her overweight dog seated on her lap, who looked extremely grateful to have the weight lifted off his feet. "This is Conway," she said, introducing the dog to my father. "Unfortunately, Conway's not very happy at the moment, are you, boy?" Conway let out a disgruntled woof, as if he heartily agreed with my mother on this. "He looks pretty miserable, doesn't he? And he's so exhausted after having 3 walks a day, every day, as prescribed by our vet." "That's pretty rough for a small dog like himself." "That's what I think, and my mother thinks that too. My mother had to put him on a strict diet. And, of course, the 3 walks a day are really getting him down." Conway seemed to snort, almost as if the dog agreed that his life was not exactly a bowl of cherries at the moment. My father chuckled in amusement. He lifted up Conway's paw and said, "Very pleased to meet you, Conway. I'm very sorry about your strict diet and severe exercise regime. But once you've lost a little weight, you'll feel much better about yourself, I'm most sure." "He doesn't look terribly convinced about that, does he?" laughed my mother. "You're funny. I don't think anybody's ever shaken Conway's paw before. And I don't think he'd agree about feeling better. Conway loves his food far too much. And his idea of feeling good is getting lots of titbits sneakily gifted to him from under the table. It's my dad that's entirely responsible for his weight gain, although of course he'll never admit it. Conway only has to look at my father from under the table, through his dark smouldering eyes, when my dad is eating his meal, and my dad literally folds like a camping chair. The next thing you know, half the food on my father's plate is in Conway's tummy. My mother gives him a hard time about it, but he never ever listens." "Your father sounds like a soft touch," said my dad, smiling warmly at my mother. "I very much like the sound of him, and if I was a dog, I'd love him." "You sure would," my mother agreed. "Now let me show you the way to Glenford Terrace." My mother leaned forward in the passenger side seat. She pointed to the road. "You need to take a right at the end of this road over here. I'll show you where to go from here. There are quite a lot of twists and turns around here. That's why I could never draw you a map, because you'd end up in Timbuktu," she said, laughing gaily, "and then you'd be more confused than ever. And we can't have that, can we?" "You're telling me," interjected my father, "it's an absolute maze around here. It's like they do say no good deed goes unpunished, don't they? I was passing through the area, and a friend chose to take advantage of me, asking a favour of me, and it's cost me a lot of wasted time. I've been held up by my complete inability to find Glenford Place. I was about to give up and return parcel to sender, if you know what I mean. I just about had enough, so I guess my friend will owe you a special thank you for helping me deliver the parcel to the Richards. He's a bit of a cheapskate, I'm afraid. Always looking for a bargain, he is. I said to him, why don't you use the postal service, like anybody else? But my friend is very eager to save a penny when he can. He's not exactly poor." "Oh, I know people like that. The last school I went to, the girl's parents actually drove a Rolls Royce, would you believe? And yet they bought her clothes from thrift stores to save pennies. I could never understand it. They were practically made of money. Yet I arrived at school myself wearing better clothes than she ever did. She confided in me that her parents were loaded, but were so incredibly thrifty with their money. They counted the pennies all the time, when their bank accounts were literally busting at the seams, they were so full. Anyway, don't worry, I'll help you get to Glenford Terrace. That's why I'm here." My father told us at the time. He was shocked by my mother's innocent naivety, hopping into his car like a breath of fresh air, with a big, friendly, warm smile on her face, as if popping into strangers' cars was something she did as a matter of routine, almost as if it was water off a duck's back to her. In that moment his first thought was that my mother was like a rare orchid that needed protecting, and this rare orchid appeared to be tugging at his heartstrings for unfathomable reasons that he could not explain. My dad had never felt that way before about a woman that he had so fleetingly met, who had fortuitously landed on the scene of his life, rather like a lucky bird dropping on a windscreen window. He always believed love at first sight was the frivolous notion of a romantic novelist, blessed with a far-fetched, vivid imagination that had nothing to do with reality whatsoever. But his serendipitous encounter with my mother on this unassuming morning had changed his opinion on this matter forever. Ostensibly, after my father met my mother, he fell for her so hard that he didn't waste any time getting a ring on her finger. He said to me once, "Son, when the right woman crosses your path, you will know about it at once. It was absolutely serendipitous meeting your mother in the way I did, but I was befuddled that she got into the car like she did, so willingly. That was a foolish thing for her to do. I hope you don't make a habit of climbing into strangers' cars so nonchalantly," my father had said to my mother, under a raised eyebrow. "I could be anyone, couldn't I? There's some wacko people out there, some creepy weirdos that might take advantage of a beautiful woman such as yourself. under the guise of asking for directions. My sister Rachel is being forever told by my father never to accept lifts from strange men. If Rachel was taking a lift with a stranger like you are now with me, let's just say my father would be having kittens. And lots of them, I might add."
"That's hilarious. It's a good job your father's not around to see me now. What are you saying? That you are the axeman or something?" My mother said this with a mischievous, naughty twinkle in her eyes. She laughed so brightly that my father's car lit up, as it erupted with the musical bird-song of my mother's gay laughter. My father told me in that quintessential moment he absolutely knew my mother was the girl for him. He warmed to her at once, as if some of the frost in his heart that had previously been so cynical about long-lasting, enduring relationships had all but melted away. He was now entertaining thoughts of spending his entire lifetime with my mother, and he'd only just met her.
"I'm not joking, ma'am. I'm being deadly serious. You hear stories, don't you, in the papers about people hitchhiking lifts from strangers? And then what happens? They're never seen again. I would very much hate something like that to happen to such a nice lady such as yourself. You need to be careful, that's all I'm saying. I would hate to see a woman like yourself getting caught up into trouble just because she was being a good Samaritan."
"Most people are relatively good, you know," my mother said confidently. "I have faith in humanity, I really do. It's only a small amount of people on this planet that are less than savoury. I like to think I can usually pick them out in a line out. It's called being intuitive. Besides, you're not a stranger to me, are you? Well, not really. I might never have met you before, but you're delivering a parcel to the Richards. The Richards are good friends of my father's. He works for Mr. Richards, you see. So a friend of the Richards is a friend of mine. So by association, we're not exactly strangers, are we? Besides, why shouldn't I trust you? By the way, I haven't even introduced myself yet. My name is Ashley Curtis, and you are?"
"I'm Simon Roxburgh."
"Wow, that's a posh name. Do you come from an illustriously wealthy family or something? Your surname sounds like that of an English earl, or something aristocratic from Britain. It's the kind of name you'd expect to read about in an 18th century novel. Lord Roxburgh has a nice ring to it. Please tell me you're a lord. I couldn't bear it if you weren't."
"Sorry, I'm not a lord, nor am I an earl. I'm definitely not a person that comes from money. My family is very run-of-the-mill, middle class, I'm afraid. I'm very sorry to be so dreadfully boring."
"Oh, how frightfully dull," my mother said, pulling a disappointed face. "I was hoping you were going to tell me you're related to some earl or something, and you live in a grandiose mansion where servants wait on you 24/7, and you have your own butler who polishes your shoes so they shine like the noonday sun. Never mind. You can't have everything, can you? Well, I'm very pleased to meet you, Simon Roxburgh. But before you lecture me any further about the dangerous repercussions of hitching lifts with strangers such as yourself, let me direct you to the Richards' house. We're very nearly there. Believe me, without my navigational skills, which are pretty excellent, even if I say so myself, you ain't got a hope in hell in finding the place. Looking for Glenford Terrace is quite literally like looking for a needle in a haystack. It turned out my mother was absolutely right about this. My father reckons he'd have not found Glenford Terrace without my mother's help. But in those days they didn't have GPS facilities. So if you had a lousy sense of direction, you were probably absolutely stuffed. As my dad would say,
we don't all have an internal compass like migratory birds. But I guess we can dream.
To cut their love story short, let's just say I'm sure you can predict very accurately what happened next, as if tuning into your favourite rom-com. But I always believe real life is so much more interesting than what is portrayed in the movies. My mother and dad got talking as you do, after my father had dropped her back to her family home, with Conway, who hopped out of the car by her side. He was so glad to have been spared of any of the excess exercise he would have had to have undertaken on his short legs. He gave my father an appreciative look as he got out of the car. My father took down my mother's telephone number, and the phone calls invariably started. I guess they never stopped, as romance budded, blossomed, and bloomed, like the first flowers in early May, bursting joyously through the soil, in a show of bedazzling bright colours that never ever fade. My parents instantly connected, rather like two magnets being pulled together with such a powerful force that you can't tear them apart. My father told my mother when he dropped her back home that day that he would very much like to see her again if she was agreeable to this. She teasingly said, "I'll think about it, shall I?" For a moment my father's face had looked crestfallen, as he thought he might never see my mother again, and that idea did not sit well with him. My mother poked him in the chest playfully, with her coquettish, whimsical charm, and said, "Well, where do you want to go for our first date, then?" My father looked delighted. He took down my mother's number and said he'd call her. He probably called her later that day, if I know him. My father said when he was dating my mother, he couldn't wipe the big cheesy grin off his face. When his mother saw him when he returned home, after he first met my mother, the first thing she said to him was, "Who is she, son? I can see you're in love. I'd know that look anywhere. I had that look on my own face after I met your father, so I'm reasonably well acquainted with it, you know." "Nothing gets past you, does it, Mum?" My father had chuckled. "If you must know, I admit it. Yes, I've met a girl." "I knew it! I absolutely knew it!" my grandmother cooed, in delight. She was longing for my father to meet a pretty lass, and now it seemed that he had. "Of course nothing gets past me, love, but then you should know that, shouldn't you, by now? So go on, Simon, who is she? I'm bursting to know. You know me. I'm the perennial romantic. I don't want you to spare me any details. I need to know everything. You know me in a love story. Well, I just can't resist, can I?" "Her name is Ashley Curtis. She's the most delicate creature I've ever laid eyes on. I think I'm in love, Mum. But how's that remotely possible, when I've only just met this extraordinary woman? And to think I saw her walking down the road with an overweight dog called Conway. If I hadn't been delivering a parcel for Neil, I'd never have met her." "Well, I think your chance encounter with this lovely lass was preordained, don't you? I don't believe things happen by random chance or accident. Now that you've found her, love, you're not going to let her go, are you? If I were you, I'd get a ring on her finger as soon as you possibly can. And don't waste your time about it. Nothing worse than procrastination or dawdling. That can bring the death of many relationships. Don't you forget that, son, for a single second, or you'll have me to deal with, and a great deal of regret on top of it all. But might I not scare her away, Mum, if I'm over-eager and I come on too strong?" "Nothing wrong with being over-eager, son. Playing hard to get is so passé as far as I'm concerned. I can't stand people playing frivolously silly games in relationships. All this cat and mouse stuff, it's so overrated. We're grown up, for goodness sake. It's so much more preferable to be honest in a relationship, to wear your heart on your sleeve. A woman needs to know where she stands with you, what your intentions towards her are. She doesn't want you to believe you're stringing her along, or that your intentions towards her are dishonourable. When your father first met me, he said to me, 'I think I'm falling in love with you.' We'd only just met, you know. But he never kissed me for several weeks after that. We did take things slowly." "And that didn't scare you? His eagerness, I mean." "Absolutely not. Why should it scare me? I was impressed that your father wasn't playing any games with me. And you'd be wise to do the same, son. Besides, if you want something badly enough, you go for it, don't you? You don't waste your time with this one, if you feel so strongly about this young lass. You've struck gold, love. That's not going to happen again, believe me, I know. So don't you dare look a gift horse in the mouth. That's all I'm saying, love, or you will live with a great deal of regret." My father listened to his mother. He wasted no time in taking his mother's salient advice, while courting my mother, as within 3 weeks they'd got married, and it was my grandmother on my mother's side of the family who was not terribly happy about her daughter's impulsive eagerness to tie the knot, in what she considered was a terrible hurry to get married. "But you barely know Simon Roxburgh, love," she complained to my mother.
Ashley, you can't possibly know someone in only 3 weeks. The idea is ludicrous. Why are you in such a desperate rush to get married? You're a young woman. You've got all the time in the world. You're acting as if you've got a runaway train to catch.
Mum, you're a fine one to talk, aren't you? You've been rushing around all your life, moving from state to state and town to town. Everything's always been a rush with you. And now you're talking about me being in a rush. I wonder where I get it from.
Are you saying your eagerness to get married to Simon Roxburgh, after knowing him for only 3 weeks, is all my fault? I've never heard anything so ridiculous in my entire life. How can this possibly be my fault?
Relax, Mum. Calm down. I never said it was your fault, not really. I was pulling your leg. But don't worry about me, Mum. That's what I'm trying to say. I do know what I'm doing. I really love Simon. He's the one for me. I knew it from the moment we met, and it seems he felt the same way too. There was an immediate connection between us. When it's meant to be, it's meant to be. As if our destinies are written in the stars and perfectly aligned. I knew he was the one for me when he shook Conway's paw and empathised with Conway about how pitiful it was to be on a diet. He made me laugh, Mum. Nobody's done that before. All my other boyfriends were seriously stiff and pretty humdrum, humourless too, taking themselves far too seriously. But Simon Roxburgh is so funny, and I really like that about him.
You are saying he shook Conway's paw, did he? My mother asked, looking both impressed and rather bemused. Well, I guess that means he's got a jolly good sense of humour, and I do approve of that in a man. It's an extremely important quality in a relationship. Laughter is like medicine, is it not? What do you think about this, sweetheart? She said, turning to my grandfather. About our daughter's rush to get married. My grandfather said, If Ashley wants to rush into marriage, leave her be. Ashley's right, sweetheart. You've always insisted we rush from one place to another like a lightning flash. I've done your bidding over the years because we're a team, and I wanted to make you happy. But this is Ashley's life we're talking about now, not yours, not mine. You can't tell our daughter what to do, love. If she's chosen to get married to this Simon Roxburgh, after knowing him for only 3 weeks, she has my blessing. And if he shook Conway's paw, I think I like him already, because believe me, in marriage you need a jolly good sense of humour. I have to put up with you, don't I, love?
I guess if the truth be told, my mother saw in my father a dependable, trustworthy, loyal man that was as reliable as a Californian redwood tree. She knew when he laid down roots they would be equally as strong and enduring. Who doesn't want that in their marriage? With my father there would be none of this jumping around from state to state or woman to woman like a frog that's never happy with the pond it's in and always believes there's a bigger and better pond somewhere else. My mother unequivocally knew when she married my father Simon that for the first time in her life she could happily settle down in one place without feeling the rug cruelly being pulled up from under her feet, which is what her mother had relentlessly done to her over and over again in her young life, and it had made her feel somewhat unhinged. Do you mind me asking you, Mum, why did Granny Chloe make you move around so much when you were growing up? I asked her once. I just don't understand the urgency to keep moving all the time. It seems crazy to me. My mother had sighed in exasperation.
Well, it was your grandmother, Chloe. I know it's hard to believe now, but when she was younger she was what I would describe as a restless spirit. Your grandmother Chloe quite literally had ants in her pants all the time. No sooner had we settled down happily in one state, and my dad found a very good job, my mother would start whinging and complaining about something or everything. She'd come up with all kinds of nonsensical excuses as to why we as a family should move away. She'd say things like the next-door neighbour was giving her a hard time about a tree growing over the yard wall that needed cutting down, or a teacher at my school was not being very kind about me, or the weather was too hot or cold, stuff like that. Ironically, when I turned 23 years old, when I met your father down that street, our family had stopped moving around all the time. My mother, Of course she was getting itchy feet again, but my father refused to move away again. He'd said he'd had enough, and it wasn't going to happen anymore. He was tired of being out on the road, moving from state to state and place to place. I was very proud of your grandfather, standing up to my mother and finally putting his foot down. It was the best thing he ever did. They're now so happily settled. My mother Ashley chose to become a stay-at-home mother, and she intended to raise us to the very best of her ability. She did a fine job in that regard, and Grandma Chloe and Grandpa Russ were always around, which was a miracle in itself. My mother always believed how your children turned out had a whole lot to do with how you parented your own kids. She was determined to be the best mother she possibly could, so that she would be there for us at sports events and gala evenings at our local school. And she always was. Much like my sister Victoria, every afternoon I would studiously work in my bedroom doing my homework, at my desk on the second story of our house, that overlooked idyllic, prepossessing views of the Georgian countryside, along with my father's grove of peach trees that grew on the right-hand side of the valley. Let's just say in the state of Georgia, our peaches are among the tastiest and juiciest in the world. My father successfully managed his orchards the organic way to avoid unhealthy pesticides and contaminants in the peaches that can easily attach themselves to the outside skin and are not healthy to ingest unless thoroughly washed. Sometimes, with the excess of peaches from the orchards, my mother would can the peaches or sell the remainder at the farmer's market. My mother emphatically believed placing my desk opposite the window would rather be like inviting the outside in. She thought it would make me more productive with my homework. She believed the views would inspire me and invigorate my creative energy. I'm not exactly sure her idea worked. I'd often stare out the window longingly, rather like a dog drooling over a bone. I'd fantasize about being outdoors, on the back of my mountain bike, or exploring the woods with my sister Victoria. She was always up for a good time back in the day. So there we are. That's the end of part 1. Part 2 is tomorrow night. I look forward to you joining me then. Until next time, goodbye and good night.